Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Crescent Slotin, the chair of the O&A committee here at Bethlehem, and I'd like to welcome you. Thank you for sticking around after worship today for a presentation from Ben Hollenbeck. For those who are viewing on the live stream, let you know, we're going to stream Ben's presentation. You'll catch all of that. There's going to be a Q&A session afterwards, but out of privacy and respect of the folks here that will be part of that dialogue, we'll be closing the live stream after Ben's presentation. So I'll get up and we'll make that transition at that point so you folks will know that the stream has been closed up. But thank you again for coming and listening and participating. And so let me introduce our speaker for the day, brought to you by the O&A committee here at Bethlehem. Benjamin T. Hollenbeck is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Michigan. Ben earned a BA in Anthropology and Classics at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Ben's research focuses on religion with a particular emphasis on contemporary Christianity in the United States and LGBTQ+ representation within Christian groups. His dissertation is based on research he did in 3 churches in Michigan between 2017 and 2019, including Bethlehem UCC. Ben's very familiar to some of us and new to others. By focusing on how people of faith cultivate welcoming spaces, Ben's dissertation examines the ways in which congregations shape notions of what it means to be inclusive. Ben also examines the ways LGBTQ+ Christians actively construct their religiosities, did I get that? Thank you, and shape the religious institutions to which they belong. So I'd like to welcome Ben to lead us in this presentation and discussion. Thank you, Ben.
That was a long in some way. Oh, there we go. How am I on volume? Am I good? You can all hear me? That was do I just need to get a lot of, maybe if I'm here. I think it is really, I'll stand right here and then we'll be good because there is no interference anymore. No, I wrote that long and somewhat arrogant description of myself a few months ago. I'm going to give a truncated introduction of myself, but first I want to thank Crescent, I want to thank the O&A committee, I want to thank Pastor John, and I want to thank all of you for being here today. My name is Ben Hollenbeck, and like Crescent said, I'm a grad student at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. I've lived here since 2014. PhD candidate will hopefully become PhD in June. We're at the let's schedule a dissertation defense stage of my graduate career, which is not unlike herding cats. I think I'm gonna at some point try to herd some cats to see if that's actually easier than what I'm attempting to do, which is to get 4 people to meet on Zoom for 2 hours. If my committee is listening, please respond to my emails, thanks. My presentation today is called All Are Welcome in This Place, Community Debate and LGBTQ+ Inclusion. When I use the acronym LGBTQ+, I mean lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. Q can mean queer or questioning, and the plus covers the litany of sexual orientations and gender identities that are not implied in this. It's a long acronym. You might have noticed that this acronym has changed many times over the past couple of years. We'll be patient and gracious with ourselves as we work with it. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is me before the pandemic, when I was skinnier. A little bit about me. I originally come from Pennsylvania. I was raised in the UCC until our church schismed. We broke apart over particular issues, one of which being LGBTQ inclusion. And so I know sort of from experience what it means when a church breaks apart over issues that members care really deeply about. I am an anthropologist. Everybody asks, especially when I'm getting my hair cut. They're like, what do you teach? I say anthropology. And they say, what is that? And I tell them essentially that it's the study of people. I study humans, but essentially how humans relate to other humans culturally, and what culture allows us to do, what culture constrains us to do. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. I'm in particular an anthropologist of religion, so I study what people believe, what people practice, and how what people believe and practice shapes their daily lives, how what we do on a Sunday morning would affect what we do on the other 6 days of the week, who we associate with, how we vote, where we shop, what we watch or don't watch, what we listen to or don't listen to, and the worldviews that we construct. And I'm a weird anthropologist. A lot of my colleagues, well, I'm weird for a lot of reasons, but I'm a weird anthropologist primarily because I stay in the United States. A lot of anthropologists go abroad. My colleagues are all over the world, and I'm usually in Dexter, which is a little bit of a foreign land if you've been there. And I work primarily in Washtenaw, Lenawee, and Livingston counties when it comes to this research. I study mainline Protestantism. We are sitting in a mainline church. Mainline Protestants are generally known as sort of the religious establishment of U.S. Protestantism. I count 7 denominations in the mainline fold: the United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church in the USA, the United Church of Christ, the American Baptist Churches, and the Christian Church, also called the Disciples of Christ. I count these as different from more evangelical or fundamentalist forms of Protestantism in their theology, in their worship style, and their willingness to take more progressive positions on certain social issues like LGBT issues. Because I study LGBT people and how they relate to churches, I wanted to work in environments where folks were working to welcome, which is why I came here. Next slide, please. I want to start with a question, and you can just sort of shout out the answer if you want. When I say the word community to you, what do you associate that with? What are some words or thoughts or ideas you associate with the idea of community? Okay, shared values. Good. Shared experiences, yeah. Okay, we've got some shared things here. Right. Right, so it's not just you likened it to communion, coming together, covenantal. It's not an association that's taken lightly. There are bonds there. And you mentioned communion, shared practices, right? We do the same things generally on a Sunday morning. Maybe one more? So Pastor John said commune, and that brings me to my point that sort of I'm teaching this semester, and I've been reading with my students a lot of academic papers on the nature of community, what the term community means. I think I've been boring them with how much I'm talking at them about this. And commune is interesting because often I think when we think of community, we think of harmony, of things going well, of people working together without any sort of conflict or division. And community gives the vibe of being inclusive, of letting people in. But community is sort of a sword that cuts both ways. When you have community, there is a group of people, and there are other groups of people who are not in that community. Now, in some cases, when you think of a church, there's a particular community, and those who are not in it might not be in it just because they didn't show up. There might not be barriers, right, that they could just walk in if they wanted to. There are some folks for some communities, particularly church communities, that don't have the freedom to just sort of walk in and join the community. And once they join, sort of participate. So when I think about community, I want to think about all of the sharing that we talked about, but I also want to think about who doesn't necessarily get to be part of that sharing unless we actively work to make it an environment where people can share. I have broken the cardinal rule of PowerPoints, which is put very small text on there, and I'm going to read it to you so it's okay. You might notice that picture is from your very own bulletin board. I took that picture in 2016, shortly after the ONA covenant passed. If anybody remembers that day, it was very hot. It was very sweaty. By the time I left that church, I think a lot of us were very sweaty. And then the committee all went to Arbor, which no longer is open, up in Braun Court. And I will never forget when we sat down, the waiter was like, "You're so excited, what's happening?" And I think it might have been Sue Wortman was like, "We just became an O&A congregation." He was like, "What the heck does that mean?" And was very willing to explain. So my dissertation project focuses on the ways that mainline Protestants in the US make a commitment to creating welcoming spaces for marginalized people, specifically members of the LGBTQ plus community. And it's really sort of a two-pronged project. When you want to look at how people are inclusive, the first question is clearly, what do inclusive actions look like? What do we actually have to do on a Sunday morning to make a welcoming space? And not just to make a welcoming space, but to make a space in which people feel comfortable coming back again and again, of joining the church, of participating in the church, of contributing to discussions about theology, liturgy, government of the church, the future of the church, the logistics of the church. And then the second question is, how do congregations maintain community or unity within that community and manage debate and conflict? Before I came to grad school, I worked as an office manager in a Lutheran church, and I'd gone to church my whole life, but had never really seen sort of how the sausage is made of seeing council meetings and congregational meetings. And I sort of assumed that they were going to fight about things that were sort of heavy-hitting issues in the American public. They were going to fight about climate change. They were going to fight about abortion. They were going to fight about same-sex marriage. No, they fought about carpet. They fought about shingles. They fought about whether they should resurface their parking lot. The conversation that almost came to blows was whether they should sell the old little Sunday school chairs as a fundraiser. And this is not to make fun. These are real issues that cause real conflict. And when that conflict happens, I'm interested in sort of what that's representing for people, why this is an issue that they are really focused on. And that's something we can apply, I think, to our wider lives when you see people zooming in on a particular issue. So lately, you might have been watching recently some Supreme Court confirmation hearings, and there were some anxieties that came up in those hearings about things that the nominee was not sort of there to answer for, in particular things like critical race theory, participation of transgender people in high school sports. And so this question is like, why are these issues causing anxiety? And then how do we deal with that anxiety? How do we maintain our sort of bonds of fellowship while taking into account people's anxieties? So these are the big sort of questions. And to do that, I started this work in 2015 and started by finding 9 or 10 congregations in southern Michigan. There were 2 here, there was one in Detroit, there was one in Okemos, there was one out in Grand Rapids, finding congregations that were sort of actively grappling with this issue of how to become more welcoming to LGBTQ plus people. And I ended up picking the 3 congregations that I felt were the most vibrant in their planning, the most that had the most on the agenda of things to do, because as all of you have seen, it's one thing to have a vote. It's another thing to live into that vote for 4 or 5 years now. So I tried to pick congregations that were, one, gracious and hospitable and welcome to having me come and chat with them, but also folks that were really doing something substantial. So I worked here. I worked at a Presbyterian church, PCUSA church, and I worked at an Episcopal church. And all three of the congregations, yours was by far the biggest. The other two were quite small. But all three of them had made some sort of tangible commitment to be welcoming, and that they wanted to be in this work of welcoming. And I did 2 years of ethnographic work. So if you recognize me, you probably saw me a lot in 2017 and 2018. I'm unintentionally famous. I'm on your pew cards in the Habitat for Humanity photo. And thank goodness that was taken on the first day of the Habitat for Humanity trip, because I looked really terrible on the other days because it did not stop raining. And we stayed in tents. Katie, you remember the tent? Do you remember the tent fondly? No, I don't think anybody remembers the tent fondly. We had really good time. We also got really soaked, and if you ever go camping, take plastic bags to put your phone in. Pro tip. My methods primarily to do this project, anthropological research is really sort of glorified hanging out with people, at least sociocultural anthropological research. My archaeological colleagues have to be a lot more systematic, but I'm not excavating anything. I'm talking with people, I'm building relationships, I'm building rapport. So a lot of what I did was just show up to events and participate and help and build friendships with people, figure out what they were doing, why they were doing it. I also conducted interviews. I did 95. About 30 of them were here. It was a very voluntary sort of word of mouth kind of thing. I interviewed a lot of people on the O&A committee, but then also expanded that out to other folks who were interested. And I called them interviews, but I'm seeing many people in the room that I interviewed. You know that they were more sort of conversations where I talked way too much for it to be an interview. This is the problem. I'm now listening to my transcripts, and I'm like, you need to actually let other people speak, Ben, as I talk at you for half an hour. I promise we will have Q&A, and I want to hear from other people. But this was my primary way of gathering data. I took really extensive notes when I went to public events. I took notes when I did interviews. I took notes, transcribed all those into digital, and then I really I did the old-fashioned thing of printing it out and sitting with a highlighter and a pen and looking for patterns and said, okay, here are the things that are going on, and here are the real strengths and the real innovative pieces of the welcome, and here are some places where there might be a little bit of conflict. Again, there was not, to my knowledge, a lot of conflict over selling chairs here, which I was really happy about. No, but there was, if people remember the vote day, there were a few people that were not the most happy that it was happening. That is to be expected. The vote here passed by a 95% margin, which is much higher than in the other two churches where I worked, both of which had gone through full splits within the past decade. Their congregations had broken in half over this and other issues. So in many ways, Bethlehem got the landing right in a really good way. This is going to be me telling you how awesome you are for half an hour. I am ready for the next slide. My findings, my results. These are the arguments that I sort of generally make, and they're going to be things that are probably really second nature to you, but are not to my colleagues in anthropology. The anthropologists who study religion generally don't study Christianity, and the anthropologists of religion who study Christianity mostly study sort of far right, politically fundamentalist, Pentecostal, charismatic groups, not so interested in folks that are more politically moderate, more ideologically mixed, which I think are the richer places that we need to be paying attention to because they represent a substantial portion of the United States. But my results here, like I said, might seem a little second nature, but the first one, and one that I really stand by to my colleagues in LGBT studies and my colleagues in religious studies, is that mainline Protestant churches like this one and denominations like the United Church of Christ have a really vital role to play in creating, maintaining, and defending LGBTQ plus friendly Christianity. So I'll sort of paraphrase that this is the kind of place that has a really important role in making an inclusive space for LGBTQ people. I had the pleasure during this work of interviewing a lot of people who identified as LGBTQ and heard a lot of pain and a lot of hardship and a lot of rejection. Now, some of that rejection was being turned away at the door, but a lot of it was more sinister and more passive-aggressive, of sort of, come in, but we're gonna give you sort of backward glances all the time, and we're gonna not let you do this, and we're gonna not let you do that, and it really took a toll. But the sort of best kind of place that people found, where they found a connection to the sacred, but also a place where they could belong and really thrive, was in mainline Protestant congregations. So again, those 7 denominations. And I only worked in 3, but am speaking sort of more generally about the 7, although some of them have larger internal problems. The second point, mainline Protestants can be part of opposing a dominant national narrative that Christians are anti-LGBTQ+. There is that perception, and I'm sure you've heard it, of, oh, you're a churchgoer, that must mean that you are bigoted against queer people. And whenever I use queer people, I use that not as a pejorative, but as more of a catch-all term for LGBTQ. That term has sort of been reclaimed within the past decade, but I like to give that disclaimer. Despite pushing against that narrative, there's a lot of perception that Christians in the United States are anti-LGBTQ. And whenever there seems to be some sort of civil progress for LGBTQ people in the United States, you'll see these big grand statements by particular Christians that sort of push back against that. And the ones that are anti-LGBTQ are always publicized more than the ones that are pro, because that opposition is there. My third point, mainline Protestants have the fewest institutional barriers of the major American Christian groups to cultivating inclusive spaces. So when Bethlehem wanted to get an ONA designation, the UCC did not stop you. In fact, they encouraged you, and they have been encouraging their congregations since the 70s and 80s to be welcoming. And since the 80s, their recommendation was that all congregations become open and affirming. So there aren't those sorts of institutional barriers. And within the individual church, there weren't barriers to making this happen. It was done by vote, but this was a sort of democratic solution that wasn't, no one was telling you you had to or you didn't have to. This was a decision that you made as a congregation. And if I'm being honest, this is not true of all of the mainline denominations. You might have been following a little bit what's happening with the United Methodists. Maybe, shake of head. Okay, a few people. So the United Methodist Church is the largest of the mainline denominations, and it's also denominationally the most anti-LGBTQ. They still have rules on the books that queer people can't be ordained as ministers, same-sex marriage can't be performed. There's not a lot of transgender affirming theology. And so if this were a Methodist church, there would be a lot more institutional barriers to you doing this. But there would be even more if you were, example, part of the Southern Baptist Convention. That of the Christian groups in the United States, these denominations have the fewest barriers. And then the final point, again, one that everybody who's been to any church knows, is that any sort of change can be beset with controversy. And that's not a critique, that's just the way it is. And that is life, and that is everything. I am seeing that in my own department. I'm seeing that in the church that I attend. This is life, and this is how to work with it. So again, just to rehash my sort of overall argument, the mainline congregations have the potential to be really uniquely transformative spaces and do something that other churches are not institutionally as capable of doing. that there is an amount of freedom here to be innovative in what kind of welcoming gets put out to marginalized people, particularly LGBTQ people. And like any community, that can cause some internal conflict, some internal friction, and it can cause debate about what inclusion looks like. There is no inclusion to, I'm reminded now of your sermon, Pastor John, where you were saying that sort of for some, everyone's truth is their own truth, and that is the big T capital truth. I think we have something similar where everyone has an idea in their head of what inclusion means, what it means to welcome and be welcomed. But we have to figure out something that's going to work for everybody and not just one person's sort of idea of what it means to welcome. So can everybody see this on the screen? Does anybody know what this is? It is a road, but where the road is. It is a Roman road, you are right. It is the main street of Pompeii in Rome. Pompeii was a Roman city buried in ash and pumice by a volcano in the 1st century CE, and therefore we get a really good representation of what it looked like. And you will see these really deep grooves in the road. What do you think those are? Those are wheel ruts. So the city probably existed for a couple hundred years from its founding to when it was buried. These types of Roman roads were, I don't know, maybe 150, 200 years old. They were not super old, but you see with carts going up and down every day, these ruts in the stone happened. No, they do. I've been thinking about sending this PowerPoint to the legislature and be like, this is what we want. We want giant rocks with ruts in them, and then the little raised sidewalks. So yeah, years and years, day after day, and this happens too if anyone's replaced the carpet in their house anytime within the past couple of years. You'll see, once you pull it up, the places where you walk and the paths that you go. If you wear glasses, you'll see you get little ruts in your nose. The more we do something, the more we sort of get ingrained into doing it. And I'm talking about sort of physical ruts and physical grooves, but I also want to think about that culturally. That when we do things culturally, we do things in terms of our beliefs, we also get into ruts. Totally natural, totally normal, but we can examine them a little bit. So what are some ruts? Once we fall into a particular pattern, it's really easy to stay in it and even deepen it. So again, Pastor John, you said today, say the Lord's Prayer in the way that is most familiar to you, which I think is a really innovative way to do this, because in every other church I go to, we get to forgive us our, and then like the sins people and the trespasses people and the debts people all kind of yell their word, because that's the right one. I'm a Lutheran at heart, so I'm a trespasses person. However, I've begun to vibe with the debts people. But what I'm saying is that this is sort of a cultural rut, and not a harmful one, right? It might be a little harmful if you shout trespasses at someone who's shouting debts at you. You shouldn't shout at anyone in church, let alone during a pandemic. But once we fall into these patterns, it's really easy to just stay in them. If you're trying to drive a wagon down that road, it's a lot easier to stay in the ruts than to get out of the ruts. And if you try to get out of the ruts, it takes work, it takes commitment, it takes admitting that sometimes the ruts are easier, but you don't want to be in them. And this is, I think, a really good metaphor for those of us within Christianity who have a greater amount of privilege. So when I say white, cisgender, heterosexual Christians must help to forge a new path of inclusivity. I identify as a queer person, however, I am white, I am cisgender, I'm able-bodied, and as little money as I make as a graduate student, I am still okay, I think. We don't know how much they're going to raise my rent. Landlord, if you're listening, don't raise my rent. I don't think they can see me winking, and I don't even know if that's the camera, but I think it's where the camera is. The point that I'm saying is that once we're in a cultural rut, it takes labor to get out of it. And that's totally normal, and it's going to totally feel sort of weird. When I think about my research, I think about the ways that people are trying to jump out of ruts. This covenant of welcome is addressing a rut that Christianity has gotten itself into. It's actually addressing several ruts that Christianity has gotten itself into. Because if you notice, while there's a rainbow fish up there, there's a rainbow cross up there, but the covenant of welcome doesn't only welcome people regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity. It applies to a diverse tapestry of all people, no matter their age, race, nationality, ethnicity, economic circumstance, marital or family status, physical, mental ability, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. And then we invite everyone, believers, questioners, seekers, skeptics. There are a lot of ruts that this is addressing. And this is not to say Bethlehem is doing a bad job and we're going to try to do better. I think these are bigger systemic things. That there are ways that Christianity has done really good things in people's lives. There are ways that Christianity has also excluded people. And that's not to say you are all guilty of exclusion. That's to say we can all do work to make things more inclusive. We all are we all have skin in this game. We all have skin in this system, and my point here is not to say, like, you put us in these ruts, because you didn't. I didn't, but I'm also implicated in staying in the ruts sometimes when it's more comfortable for me. So the question is, how do we undergo change? But how do we keep that community too? How do we retain the shared bonds that keep us together? How can we stay in communion with one another? We don't want to lose that, but we also want to broaden who might be able to participate. Thank you for being my PowerPoint person. So in my research, I found several ways that people work to get out of the ruts. I'm going to talk about the designation in a minute, but I want to start with the most ubiquitous way, the most commonplace way that people did this, which was discussion and education. I spent a lot of time in small groups, whether they were small prayer groups, Bible studies, reading groups, or smaller administrative groups, like worship committees, for example. And those groups involved a lot of talking over things, about people talking about where they were with certain issues and where they were in their lives and how they got to that. And that kind of talking did wonders, because it gave everybody a face and a story, and it gave everybody motivations. And people got to see sort of where they were and why they were there. So for example, in one of the other churches where I worked, we did a reading group that was on the, we call them the clobber passages. They're really only 6, but some people say 8. The verses in the Bible that are often used to condemn LGBTQ identified people. So Genesis, Leviticus, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy. And we took week after week looking at these verses one by one, and I didn't plan this. They wanted to do this on their own. I just showed up and brought my very heavy study Bible. And we had a lot of good conversations about the ways that people had been taught these particular verses. So if you're taught that the Sodom story in Genesis is supposed to mean a particular thing, it's really hard to just say, oh, it doesn't mean that anymore. I totally get that. There are certain, when you read something a certain way and are taught something a certain way for so many decades, it's a rut you're in. But the conversation about how particular interpretations or particular verses could harm people, and ways in which those verse interpretations don't really hold up well against sort of interpretive scrutiny, those conversations took time, and there were arguments, as there always are, but they were generally arguments had in love and with support, and because these were smaller groups, people knew each other, they knew each other's hearts and their struggles, and that really worked well. Also, education. I know the O&A committee prior to the vote had a pretty intense education campaign, and I use intense in the best way. I'm also intense in the best way. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Every Sunday for at least a month prior to the vote, there were the testimonies, and then your sermons also, and especially the sermon you gave right before the vote. That was your sweep your own side of the street sermon. Do you remember that? Yes, I do. It was a good sermon, and obviously a very effective sermon. That education can take a number of forms. It can be in the service, it can be out of the service. And preaching is a really good example also of this second piece, which is looking at the liturgy, looking at the order of worship, and thinking about the ways that we can disrupt those ruts a little bit by our worship. And so a lot of that has to do with preaching. And I worked with 4 or 5 pastors during this and saw some really innovative preaching over the 2 years that worked to address some of these pieces and deal with issues that the congregations were divided on. I am not a pastor, Pastor John, so I'm going to speak as a scholar, but you tell me if I'm correct. I gave a presentation last month at a conference where I essentially said, being a pastor is like being the mayor of New York City. Everything is your fault. It doesn't matter what you do. Some people will not like it, and they will tell you about it in the parking lot. I don't know if the mayor of New York City is confronted in parking lots, but I know that this happens, and that as a visible figure at the head of the congregation, when it comes to preaching, when it comes to administration, there's a lot of scrutiny. And in spite of that, I saw pastors really doing some interesting and innovative preaching that both brought in theology and scripture, but also brought in people's stories and people's experiences to sort of show that having conversations about these things, having conversations about LGBTQ plus people in a congregational space is totally appropriate. There was a time when we might not have thought it was appropriate, but now this has become more appropriate. And then it becomes a question of what else can we talk about? We should talk about racism. We should talk about classism. We should talk about the environment. And it doesn't matter where you sort of fall on those issues, you can still talk about them, right? And have dialogue. So preaching was one. Big changes to liturgy I also saw were in who was participating. In all 3 of the churches, there was more of an effort in the time I was there to include people who belong to the LGBTQ community. Serving communion, taking up the offering, reading the liturgy, serving at coffee hour, greeting, things like this. Not doing it sort of like, here is our token gay person to say hello to you. That did happen to me once at a church. There was a wedding, and they're like, we'd like a token gay person to stand at the door. Are you cool with that? And I said, no. Tokenizing is not good. But anyway, not because of that, but just this idea of anyone is capable of doing this, and we need to start sort of normalizing that. And also you saw changes to the hymns that were being sung sometimes, things that were not more relevant, but that spoke to particular texts or particular ideas, prayers, confessions, things like that, being really innovative in the kinds of ways that those were deployed. I'm really rambling at you, and I understand. We're almost through. The welcoming designations. So of the 3 churches where I worked, yours was the only one that actually adopted a covenant of welcome. The other 2 decided not to, which was really interesting. One didn't because of the conflict it would have caused, and one didn't because they said that this was already so implicit that nobody needed to know it. I would push back against that. But this idea of how to make this inclusion known and how to communicate to people walking past that you're a welcoming space is really important. And again, I really love this covenant because it really names the ruts that we're trying to get out of. And so I understand and respect the position of the church that didn't want to adopt something like this because they thought that it would be divisive. I don't agree with it because it is, it's calling out the things that we need to work on, and it's okay that we need to work on things. But just thinking about this was the day that the outdoor plaque was dedicated, and the grass looked really wet, and all of you still walked in it anyway. So good for you. And you have the doors, and there are so many, and I know that I know that the banner that was on the back fence was taken. I want to just note that this has happened at all of the congregations where I've worked. Yeah. Yes. Well, and this was, so Pastor John said that there were holes punched in the doors. I know that First Congregational also has doors, and those were vandalized a couple weeks ago. This is unfortunately quite normal. The Episcopal church where I worked decided to hang a rainbow flag. That was torn down, and actually the hooks in the ceiling were also torn out, so they're now just holes. They responded by the one being taken down by putting up 3, which I appreciated. But this question of sort of how to communicate to the wider world and the things that you have to be prepared for because people are mean-spirited sometimes. And then finally, just the thing that I had the most joy in when I got to do this work was just hanging out with people and figuring out what people got from this institution. Obviously, everyone is here, so there's something about this institution, hopefully many things, that you really love and treasure in your life. And the fact that these are the kinds of environments where sexual orientation and gender identity doesn't necessarily bar people to having that kind of participation is really important. Because, I think about when this congregation had its vote, and a few people did leave afterwards, and that was expected. The committee, I hope I'm not sharing too much, you anticipated this. You anticipated that the vote would not be 100%, and it happened anyway. Oh, yes. Yes, because everything is your fault, remember, you're the mayor of New York City.
Where that's correct is I helped one Methodist church get as close as we could.
Right.
And then the last church in this church became Bethlehem. And it doesn't matter if you're 90% or whatever. You get the emails and the phone calls, or you can actually hold it. And it's relentless.
Right,
And
right.
you don't realize that there's a price paid that it's not dispersed, it's like that.
Right,
And that's just saying it's important and there's a cost.
right,
And it's not going to get done unless there's a cost.
right, right.
Our LA team was amazing. So,
Yes, and very patient. The ONA team was very good at, and this was true of you, Pastor John. This was true of Sue Boudet, who was the president of the congregation at the time, taking the time on that day to sort of answer the questions, to sort of talk people down a little bit. And again, it was a 95%. That's amazing. Any politician would love a 95%. The Ann Arbor City Council would love a 95% approval rating. It is far more likely that the Southern Baptist Convention will become inclusive within the next year. But anyway, I think the sort of truth of this is that if someone is disgruntled or upset or not in approval of a church being inclusive in a particular way, that is their right, and we don't want to see them go. And this is not to discount their experience, but if you are a Christian in the United States who believes that that churches should be exclusive on a de facto or de jure basis towards LGBTQ people, there are other churches where you can go and be welcomed and be agreed with. This is not true for a majority of LGBTQ people. There are not tons of places that can offer a good, solid, I don't want to say a true welcome, but a welcome that is not with a lot of expectations of you must hide this part of yourself, you must do these particular things. And obviously we do have expectations for being part of an institution, but not those that apply to you can't bring your partner, you can't bring your kids, you can't talk about your transition, you can't talk about coming out. These things are not appropriate. When you hear things like that, those are expectations. So this is not, again, to discount the experience of people who don't want to be part of that, but again, there are spaces, and there are many spaces where that viewpoint is shared widely. And it's like you said, Pastor John, the fact that there is pushback means that it is an important issue, and that it's making an important impact in people's lives. So what's next? I've talked for far longer than I thought I have, but there are two things that I want you to think about sort of moving forward. That I'm really thinking about in my work and when I hopefully do future research in some other contexts that I want to think about. And it's connecting LGBTQ inclusion to the ideas of intersectionality and anti-racism. These are two buzzwords that you hear a lot in the modern discourse, so I'm going to unpack them a little bit. I'm ready. Intersectionality, what I mean by intersectionality is just the interconnectedness of social categories. So a person who identifies as gay or lesbian is not just a gay or lesbian person in isolation. They also have a racial identity, a class identity, a gender identity, an ability identity, an age. There are and a religious identity. We're in a church. We all are sort of culminations of many different identities together. And some of those identities provide certain privileges or advantages, and some do not. And that's not something to feel guilty over. That's not something it's just something to think about. So when we think about this, and I love this idea of abundant life, one of the many good things that Jesus said he wanted for humanity was for people to have life and have it abundantly. And when I think about abundant life, I think about this sort of embrace of all of one's identities coming together, and not just sort of one category. So when we want an inclusive space for LGBTQ plus people, we want a white gay man who is 50 years old to be welcomed in the same way that we want a black trans woman who's 25 years old to be welcomed. And those are different identity categories, and they're going to require different kinds of education and different kinds of policy to be inclusive, because they're different ruts, right? All of these ruts, and racism is a really deep rut. It is potentially the deepest. Because people are comfortable in the deep rut of racism, they are comfortable in other ruts too, like the rut of homophobia and transphobia. So we can't, when we think about being inclusive, we can't always just think about LGBTQ people in isolation, which is this is an intersectional document up here. You are doing intersectional work. I'm sort of preaching to the choir here. So my summary of this is good job. As I said, the rut of racism is really, really deep and has an effect on the kinds of inclusion that people will bring to a church. And so whenever I have a conversation about this, I always like to sort of end with this idea that any conversation about LGBTQ inclusion also needs to be a conversation about how do we disrupt patterns of racism. I think, and this is out of my pay grade to comment on, but I think a lot of the controversy right now, sort of in the wider culture, over how we talk about race and racism, is that it is often taught and it's often believed that racism is a thing that happens between two people, that it's an interpersonal, like a racist says a racist thing to someone else. And we don't think about the sort of bigger systems that have allowed that to happen. And Ron DeSantis, if you're listening, I will not try to teach in Florida. I know that was critical race theory. I'm sorry. I'm not actually sorry. I think just this idea of acknowledging systems is really important, and thinking about the ways that systems of oppression can hurt marginalized people across identity categories. So if it is a racist issue, that is going to affect LGBTQ people. That is going to affect people of lower socioeconomic class. That's going to affect people of religious minority status. So thinking about the ways that the sort of ruts of oppression that are stuck in, and how we want to jump out of that is not just a conversation about LGBT inclusion. It's a wider conversation of how do we open the church. So my conclusion, which went 20 minutes longer than I wanted to, but this is difficult because it requires a lot of work and a lot of soul searching, and what I'm not saying, again, is this idea of not to be proud of the things that you have done as a congregation, because you've done a lot, and this is not to say you need to do more. I'm not saying it like that. I'm saying that because you have done this and you've created this amazing intersectional document that makes a covenant. It is a covenant of welcome. It's not a welcoming designation. It is a covenant. And because you have this covenant, you're now in this amazing realm of possibility to sort of figure out what can we keep doing, and that's what you're doing, and you're making this progress. The last question I want to leave you with is just to this idea, when we think about the we, whether it's the we of the congregation or the we of a religion or a city or a country, think about who the theys are, think about who's not at the table, or who's at the table but doesn't have power, and think about sort of why those things are. And with that, I think I'd like to go to questions, if that's okay. Thank you for sitting through my talking at you. Yes.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Oh, sorry.
Appreciate it.
I think we're going to do questions with the mic, right?
Yep, so if folks have questions, and actually, just as a reminder for those live streaming, we're going to close that down, again, out of